Here is a number that should unsettle anyone who has ever inherited anything or plans to leave something behind: 70%. That is the percentage of family wealth that fails to survive the transition from the first generation to the second. Not fails over 500 years, not fails over a century, fails in one single handoff, from the person who built it to the children who received it, and it gets worse. By the third generation, 90% of family fortunes are gone, dissolved, not through some dramatic market crash, not through a war, not even through bad investments in most cases. They are dissolved through something far more mundane and far more human: disagreement. A study conducted across decades of family wealth research, cited repeatedly by institutions like the Williams Group Wealth Consultancy, traced the causes of this collapse. The results surprised almost no one who has ever sat through a contentious family dinner, and horrified almost everyone who assumed money problems were about money. 60% of the failures came down to a breakdown in trust and communication between family members. 25% came from heirs who were never prepared to receive or manage what they were given. Only 3%, came from poor investment advice, tax planning failures, or legal mistakes. Let that sit for a moment. The overwhelming driver of generational wealth collapse is not incompetence with money. It is the absence of a functioning family, which raises an obvious question. If money doesn't destroy itself, and if the mechanics of investing and taxation account for almost none of the failure, how have a small number of families managed to defy these odds for 500 years? How did the Rothschilds coordinate 5 sons across 5 countries in the 1800s without the empire fracturing into rival factions? How does a family today, 3 or 4 generations removed from the wealth creator, still sit in the same room and make decisions together instead of suing each other? The answer is not a trust structure. It is not a clever tax strategy. It is a document, and more importantly, a process that almost no one outside of ultra-wealthy families has ever heard of: the family constitution. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. Today we're taking it apart. The problem constitutions are actually solving. Before we look at what a family constitution is, we need to be precise about what problem it exists to solve, because most people, on hearing the phrase, assume it's a euphemism for a will or an estate plan or some kind of formalized favoritism. It is none of those things. A will governs what happens to property after death. A trust governs how assets are held and distributed. Both are backward-looking in a sense. They respond to a single event, the death of the wealth holder, and then execute a plan. A family constitution operates on an entirely different axis. It governs the family while everyone is still alive. It is not about what happens to the money when someone dies. It is about how the living family makes decisions, resolves disputes, defines who is in the business and who is not, and transmits values across a widening web of relatives who, by the 3rd generation, may barely know each other. Consider the mathematics of family expansion. A wealth creator has, on average, 2 to 4 children. Those children each have 2 to 4 children of their own. By the 3rd generation, a single fortune that once had one clear decision maker might now have 15, 20, or 30 stakeholders. Cousins who grew up in different countries, married into different value systems, and have wildly different levels of involvement in and knowledge of the family enterprise. Some are in the business day to day. Some have never set foot in a company meeting. Some resent the ones who are in. Some resent being expected to care about a business they never chose. This is not a hypothetical problem. It is a structural certainty. Every family that accumulates significant wealth and does not actively die out will eventually face this exact widening. The question was never whether the family would fragment into competing interests and perspectives. It inevitably will, the same way a single cell inevitably divides. The question is whether the family has built anything to manage that fragmentation before it happens, or whether it will discover the problem for the first time in the middle of a crisis, usually right after the founder's funeral, when emotions are highest and the rules are least clear. Family business researchers have a term for this: the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations pattern, and versions of the same proverb exist in strikingly different cultures: rice paddy to rice paddy in parts of East Asia, clogs to clogs in the Netherlands, from stables to stars to stables in Italy. The universality of the proverb across unrelated cultures is itself a data point. It suggests the pattern isn't cultural, it's structural. Wealth without governance regresses toward dissipation in almost every society that has ever tried to hold on to it. A family constitution is the governance layer inserted specifically to interrupt that regression. It is at its core an agreement, usually written, though not always legally binding in the way a contract is, that answers a set of questions the family would otherwise be forced to answer under duress for the first time during a crisis. Questions like who gets to work in the family business and under what conditions? What happens if a family member wants to sell their shares? Can they sell to an outsider, or must it go to other family members first, and at what price? How are major decisions made? By majority vote, by consensus, by a council? What happens when a spouse marries in? Do they get a voice? What happens in a divorce? Does the departing spouse retain any claim on family assets? How does the family define who even counts as family for the purposes of benefits, employment, and decision rights, once you're 4 generations and 30 cousins deep? None of these are questions about tax efficiency. All of them are questions about power, fairness, and belonging, the exact terrain where families are most likely to fracture, because these are the questions that touch identity and self-worth, not just balance sheets. If you've ever wondered why some families stay unified for centuries, while others can't make it through one inheritance without a lawsuit, this channel exists to show you the actual mechanics behind that difference, not the folklore, the architecture. Subscribe, because we're about to look at a family that used exactly this kind of document to survive 500 years of European chaos. The Fugger Precedent codifying the family before governance was a word if you want to see the earliest known ancestor of the modern family constitution. You don't look at a Silicon Valley tech fortune or even a Gilded Age American dynasty. You look at Augsburg, Germany, in the early 1500s, to a merchant and banking family named Fugger. At the time, arguably the wealthiest family in Europe, financiers to the Habsburg emperors, controllers of copper and silver mining operations that stretched across Central Europe. Jakob Fugger, later known as Jakob Fugger the Rich, built the family's fortune from a modest textile trading operation into what many economic historians consider the largest private fortune, relative to the size of the European economy at the time, in history. But Jakob understood something that many wealth creators before and after him did not. A fortune built by one extraordinarily capable individual does not automatically survive contact with that individual's less capable, or simply differently motivated, relatives. So Jakob did something unusual for his era. he established formal house rules governing the family firm. Rules about who could bind the company financially, how profits were to be reinvested versus distributed, and critically, rules about the family's charitable obligations. Most famously, the Fugger, a walled social housing complex in Augsburg that Jakob established in 1521 to house the city's poor for a nominal annual rent. The Fugger still exists today. It is, remarkably, still operated according to principles the Fugger family established 500 years ago, and residents still pay a symbolic annual rent that has become a kind of living historical artifact. A single Rhenish guilder, the medieval equivalent of less than $2. The lesson embedded in the Fugger is one that recurs constantly in family governance research. The families that endure are not simply the ones that protected their capital. They are the ones that built an identity and a purpose around the capital that was bigger than any single family member's personal enrichment. When Jakob Fugger tied the family name to an institution of public charity, he did something functionally identical to what modern family constitutions do when they include mission statements and values sections. He gave future generations of Fuggers a reason to stay unified around something other than simply dividing up the money. A shared purpose is stickier than a shared bank account because a shared purpose gives people an identity. An identity survives disagreements about money far better than mere self-interest does. The Fugger dynasty, it should be said honestly, did not last forever in its original commercial form. The family's fortunes declined significantly after a series of sovereign debt defaults by the Spanish crown in the late 1500s and early 1600s left the Fuggers dangerously overexposed to a single counterparty, which is its own lesson about concentration risk that we'll leave for another script. But the Fugger name, the Fugger institution, and lines of the family persist to this day, an almost unheard of 5-century continuity for a European merchant house. In an era with no dynasty trusts, no modern corporate law, and none of the legal machinery we now take for granted. The mechanism that Jakob Fugger stumbled onto, centuries before anyone had a formal name for it, is the same mechanism modern family offices spend enormous sums trying to recreate. Codify the rules while the founder is still alive and has the authority to make them stick. Tie the family's identity to something larger than individual enrichment, and build in an obligation that outlives any single generation's whims. What a modern family constitution actually contains. Let's move from the historical precedent to the modern architecture, because the phrase family constitution gets used loosely, and the actual documents, the ones drafted today by family governance consultants, wealth psychologists, and specialized law firms working with multi-generational families, follow a fairly consistent structure across 4 core components. The first component is the values and mission statement. This section reads almost like a corporate mission statement, but its function is different. It exists to answer the question, why does this family stay together at all once the original wealth creator is gone? Families that skip this section and jump straight to rules about money almost always regret it, because rules without a shared why behind them feel arbitrary to the generation that didn't help write them. A well-constructed mission section will typically name the founding story of the wealth, the values the family wants to be known for, and, critically, what the family wants its wealth to accomplish in the world, beyond simply existing. This is where anonymous philanthropy commitments, environmental stewardship principles, or education mandates often get formalized. The second component is governance structure, who decides what and how. This is the part that does the heaviest lifting in preventing collapse. Most sophisticated family constitutions establish a tiered decision-making body. At the top sits something often called a family council or family assembly. Every adult family member, regardless of whether they work in the business, gets a seat and a voice here, usually meeting once or twice a year. Below that sits a smaller family board or family office board, typically composed of family members who are actively engaged, sometimes alongside independent outside directors who bring professional discipline and, crucially, have no emotional stake in old sibling rivalries. And separate from both of these sites the operating business itself, which, in the best-governed families, is run according to merit and professional competence, not birthright. This separation matters enormously. It answers the single most explosive question in any wealthy family. Does being a Smith automatically entitle you to a job, a salary, and decision-making power at Smith Industries? In poorly governed families, the answer defaults to yes, and the business slowly fills with underqualified relatives collecting salaries they didn't earn, while genuinely talented family members who wanted to build something get sidelined by cousins with more forceful personalities. In well-governed families, the Constitution explicitly separates family membership from business employment. You can be fully in the family, full economic beneficiary, full voice in the family council, without ever setting foot in the company, and conversely, family members who do want to work in the business are typically required to meet the same qualifications and answer to the same performance standards as any outside hire, sometimes including a requirement to work for a competitor or another company for several years first, precisely to prove they can succeed on their own merits before joining the family enterprise. The third component is the rules around ownership and liquidity, essentially, what happens when a family member wants out. This is arguably the most legally technical section, and it usually includes buy-sell provisions, valuation methodologies for family shares, and rules governing what happens to shares in the event of divorce, death, or a family member simply wanting to cash out and pursue an entirely different life. Without this section clearly defined in advance, a single family member's divorce can force the sale of a business that took 5 generations to build because a departing spouse's legal claim on marital assets was never addressed until the divorce lawyers were already involved. The fourth component is the dispute resolution mechanism, and this is the part almost no outsider expects. Sophisticated family constitutions don't assume disputes won't happen. They assume disputes will happen constantly, and they build a pre-agreed process for handling them before anyone is angry. This often includes mandatory mediation clauses, family councils empowered to hear grievances, and sometimes a rotating family ombudsperson role, a trusted, often professionally trained relative or advisor whose entire job is to catch conflicts before they escalate into legal action. The genius of pre-agreeing to a dispute process while everyone is calm is that it removes the option of litigation as first resort during the exact moments when people are least capable of thinking clearly. Moments like right after a parent's death, or during a divorce, or when one sibling feels the others have always favored someone else. The Rothschild case study, governance across 5 countries. No family illustrates the power of codified governance better than the Rothschilds, and the reason is almost mathematical in its clarity. Mayor Amschel Rothschild sent 5 sons to 5 different European capitals, Frankfurt, London, Paris, Naples, and Vienna, in the early 1800s, and somehow the resulting empire did not fracture into 5 competing, rival Rothschild businesses the way logic might predict. The mechanism Mayer Amschel used was not a mission statement. It was something more binding, a family partnership agreement, periodically renewed that legally required unanimous consent among the brothers for major decisions, restricted family shares from being sold to outsiders, and, in a detail that historians of the family often highlight, encouraged intermarriage among cousins specifically to keep both capital and decision-making concentrated within the family line rather than dispersing to in-laws with no stake in the shared enterprise. Whatever one thinks of that particular practice by modern standards, its underlying logic was pure governance engineering. Minimize the number of external stakeholders who could pull the family in divergent directions. The 5 Rothschild houses operated independently day to day. The London house under Nathan Rothschild became famously dominant in British finance, while the Paris house under James built enormous influence in French railways and industry. But major strategic decisions, and crucially, the reputation and creditworthiness of the Rothschild name itself, were treated as a shared asset that no single brother was permitted to unilaterally risk. This is the same principle underlying modern family constitutions' governance councils. The family name and collective reputation function as a form of shared capital, and shared capital requires shared, agreed-upon rules of stewardship, or it degrades through the uncoordinated actions of individuals, each optimizing for themselves. The Rothschild agreements were periodically renewed and updated across generations, not treated as a document written once and frozen in amber, but as a living framework revisited as circumstances changed. This is a detail modern family governance consultants emphasize constantly, and family constitutions almost universally build in a mandatory revision clause, often requiring the document to be revisited every 5 to 10 years, or whenever a major family event, a death, a divorce, a 4th generation coming of age, makes the existing rules obsolete. A constitution frozen at the moment of its writing becomes exactly as brittle as having no constitution at all, just more slowly. This is the pattern across almost every dynasty we've studied on this channel. The ones that survive don't rely on the founder's genius lasting forever. They build the rules into the family itself. If this kind of mechanism-first history is what you're here for, the subscribe button is right there, and I genuinely appreciate it. It's the only way this kind of research-heavy content keeps getting made. Why most families never write one, and what happens when they don't. If family constitutions are this effective, a fair question is why more wealthy families don't have one. The honest answer is a mix of psychology and timing, and it's worth being specific about both, because the pattern is remarkably consistent across cases studied by family business researchers. The first barrier is that drafting a family constitution requires the wealth creator to confront their own mortality and their own eventual loss of control. And many first-generation wealth builders, particularly founders with strong dominant personalities, resist formal succession planning precisely because it feels like an admission that they won't always be the one making the decisions. There's a well-documented psychological pattern among founders, sometimes called founder's syndrome, in governance literature, where the very drive and control instincts that built the fortune become a liability the moment the task shifts from building to transmitting. The second barrier is that the ideal time to draft a constitution, early while relationships are still warm and no one has a specific grievance yet, is precisely the time when nobody feels any urgency to do it. Families tend to only seriously engage with governance work after a crisis has already occurred. a bitter dispute over a family business decision, a divorce that threatens to fracture ownership, or the death of the founder without adequate planning. By that point, the document is being negotiated by people who no longer fully trust each other, which is exactly backwards from how it should work, and negotiations conducted from a place of accumulated grievance produce far weaker, more adversarial documents than negotiations conducted from a place of shared optimism. There is a well-known, cautionary counterexample in modern business history: the Gucci family. Guccio Gucci built the fashion house in Florence in the 1920s, and by the third generation, the absence of any real governance structure, combined with a business that had grown vastly larger and more complex than the family relationships managing it, led to a decades-long saga of lawsuits, a criminal tax evasion conviction, a boardroom coup, and ultimately a member of the family, Maurizio Gucci, being murdered in 1995 in a killing commissioned by his ex-wife. The Gucci name itself was entirely severed from family ownership by the mid-1990s, sold off in stages to outside investment groups. It is now one of the most frequently cited case studies in family business programs, specifically because it demonstrates, in the most extreme terms possible, what happens when a growing, valuable enterprise has no agreed-upon rules for how family members relate to it, to each other, and to outside stakeholders. The Gucci case is often taught alongside the Rothschild and Fugger examples for a reason. It isn't a story about a family that lacked wealth, talent, or opportunity. It's a story about a family that had all three, and no governance architecture whatsoever to prevent those advantages from being consumed by internal conflict. The psychological function: why written rules reduce emotional warfare. There's a deeper mechanism at work in family constitutions that's worth pulling apart, because it explains why a piece of paper, often not even legally enforceable in the way a contract is, can carry so much practical weight in preventing family collapse. Family systems researchers who study wealth transitions point to something worth naming plainly. Money conflicts in families are very rarely actually about money. They are proxy fights for older, unresolved questions about fairness, favoritism, and belonging that usually predate the conflict over the specific asset by decades. A dispute over who inherits the family lake house is almost never really about the lake house. It is about who felt loved more as a child, who felt like the favorite, who felt overlooked. Money simply becomes the battlefield onto which those older, unspoken grievances get relitigated, because money is concrete and lake houses are divisible in a way that childhood feelings are not. A well-constructed family constitution interrupts this dynamic by moving the rules out of the realm of interpersonal negotiation, where they get contaminated by decades of sibling history, and into the realm of pre-agreed, impersonal structure. When a rule about share buyouts was written 5 years before anyone was upset and applies identically to every family member, regardless of who they are or how their parents felt about them, it becomes far harder to experience that rule as a personal attack. This is precisely why family governance consultants insist on drafting constitutions during periods of family harmony rather than crisis. A rule agreed to in a calm moment feels like fairness. The identical rule imposed during a fight feels like a weapon. This is also why the values and mission section of a constitution, the part that might look on its surface like soft, unnecessary preamble, does real structural work. Families that can articulate a shared purpose beyond the money give every member, including the ones who feel less favored or less involved, a form of belonging that isn't contingent on their share of the balance sheet. That shared identity becomes the thing that survives arguments about specific financial decisions, the same way Jacob Fugger's charitable housing project gave 5 centuries of Fugger descendants something to be proud of that had nothing to do with how large or small their personal inheritance happened to be. This is exactly the kind of mechanism most people assume is either luck or secrecy, when it's actually just structure most families never bother to build. If you want more of these breakdowns, the actual architecture behind generational wealth, not the aesthetic of it, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which dynasty you want us to dissect next. Building one today, the practical process. Modern family offices, used for families building this kind of structure today. And this section applies whether you're managing 8 figures or 11. The practical process, modern family offices and governance consultants follow, tends to run through a fairly consistent sequence. It typically begins with individual interviews, conducted by a neutral third party, with every adult family member separately. Not in a group setting, precisely because people say different things in private than they do in front of a parent or a sibling they're competing with. These interviews surface the actual grievances, hopes, and fears that will need to be addressed long before anyone drafts a single clause. From there, the family typically holds a series of facilitated family meetings, often over a period of months, sometimes years for larger, more complex families, where the values and mission section gets drafted collaboratively, ensuring every generation, not just the wealth creator, has genuine input. Governance consultants consistently note that constitutions imposed top-down by a single patriarch or matriarch without buy-in from the next generation tend to be quietly ignored the moment that person is no longer alive to enforce them. A constitution only works if the people bound by it feel some ownership over having written it. The governance structure, the councils, the boards, the voting mechanisms, typically gets drafted with the help of legal counsel, specifically because certain provisions, like buy-sell agreements and share transfer restrictions, need to be legally enforceable, even though the document as a whole often functions more as a moral and social contract than a strict legal one. Many family constitutions explicitly state that they are not intended to be legally binding in their entirety, precisely so that the family can treat disputes as family matters governed by family process, rather than immediately escalating every disagreement into litigation. Finally, and this is the step most families skip and later regret, the document gets a built-in review mechanism and, critically, a plan for how it gets introduced to the next generation. The best-governed families don't simply hand an adult child a copy of the family constitution on their 18th birthday and expect it to mean anything. They build years of prior exposure, informal family meetings, junior board observer roles, mentorship from older relatives, so that by the time a young family member is old enough to be legally bound by these rules, the rules already feel familiar, earned, and understood, rather than arriving as a surprise set of restrictions imposed on their inheritance. If you're at the point in your own family's journey where this conversation needs to happen, the hardest part usually isn't the legal drafting. It's getting everyone to the table in the first place. That's a topic in itself, and it's coming to this channel soon. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath everything in this script. The families who make it to 500 years, or even just to the 4th generation without a lawsuit, are not smarter than everyone else, and they are not luckier. They simply accepted, earlier than most, that a fortune without a government is just a pile of money waiting for a disagreement to break it apart. Jacob Fugger understood this in 1521, without a single modern legal instrument to help him. The Rothschilds understood it well enough to keep 5 brothers in 5 countries pulling in the same direction for the better part of a century, and the Guccis are remembered today as much for their governance failure as for their fashion. A reminder that talent and wealth alone have never been sufficient protection against a family that never agreed on its own rules. The Constitution isn't a document about money. It never was. It's a document about whether a family spread across generations and continents and increasingly distant relationships still chooses to be a family at all. This isn't hidden. It's just never taught. If you found this valuable, the next video in this series looks at how old money families handle the family members who don't want to play by any of these rules at all. The trust structures built specifically to manage a difficult relative without destroying the rest of the family. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch it. See you in the next one.